Good afternoon. Welcome to the IDB Pavilion. We're going to start the meeting, Climate Change Adaptation for Food Security in Central America. Let me introduce you to Mrs. Lina Salazar, who is the lead specialist on the topic. Welcome, Lina.
Thank you very much, Grace, and thank you everybody for being here with us today. I want to particularly thank our panelists. I'm very honored to be with you all. I think this is a very important topic for Latin America and for Central America specifically. So I want to mention first, to give a little bit of context on the panel, that global food systems are facing unprecedented challenges. Producing enough food for a growing population, protecting natural resources, eradicating poverty, offering prosperous livelihoods, and expanding access to healthy and nutritious diets, all this while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is not a minor task. In Latin America and the Caribbean was the only region in the world to achieve the Millennium Development Goal of halving the population undernourished between 1990 and 2015. Unfortunately, since then, we have observed an increase in the number of people who's facing food insecurity, particularly in Central America. These numbers have been increasing rapidly. In 2023, the FAO estimated that 37% of the population in the Latin American and the Caribbean region are food insecure. That represents 247 million people. And 6.5%, which represents about 43 million people, face hunger. Moreover, Latin America is the region with the, is the region with the highest cost of accessing healthy diets in the world. A region where the third of the population lives in poverty and less than a quarter cannot afford a nutritious diet. So these are all very important data and information. And today, to talk a little bit about the challenge of climate change adaptation for food security in Central America, we have a very distinguished panelist. And so first I want to introduce to Ricardo Montero. He's the Technical Regional Coordinator of the Executive Secretariat of the Central American Agricultural Council. I also want to introduce Juan Carlos, Juan Carlos Mendoza, sorry, I dropped everything. The Director of Environment, Climate, Gender and Social Inclusion Division at the IFAD. And then I want to introduce also Cristina Coc, which is here with us today from Belize. Cristina is, has a very long history of advocating for indigenous rights in the worldwide. She's a spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance and the Toledo Alcaldes Association, and a long-time human and indigenous rights defender. So thank you all for being with us today, the IDB. And so I just want to start with a very controversial question, and it's about whether we can have it all. So when referring to agri-food systems, can we achieve net zero emissions, restore degraded resources, stop deforestation, restore natural resources, improve livelihoods, and boost climate change resilience while providing nutritious food for all? Are we asking too much, or can we really have it all? So what are your insights on this? So Juan Carlos, if you want to start.
Thank you very much for the interesting question, but I'll try to do my best. We cannot have it all with just one solution, but we can have it all if we take a much broader approach. We could potentially have it all. I mean, when it comes to agriculture, agriculture generates about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So to move to a zero emission agri-food system may be complex. However, there can be solutions that can be brought together, for example. And maybe I'll use some very specific cases in Central America. We're working in Nicaragua in repurposing for smallholder farmers their coffee plantations to move towards first varieties that are more climate resilient and that are grow under shade. So it's also coffee, which by the way gets higher income, and then income that can be used for example, food security. Let's not forget that food security can also come through that pathway, not just by the food that the producers are generating directly. But when answering your question, what is it that we're seeing? We are seeing, okay, first, increased income, which hopefully will lead to increased food security of farmers. We're seeing also the use of agroecological techniques that leads to lower CO2 emissions in the production of agricultural inputs, such as agrochemicals. We're also seeing reforestation, because now these farmers are growing coffee that grows under shade, that generates a higher income. So this is just an example of a situation where an intervention which is not meant to, for example, do mitigation or reduce emissions, but it is ultimately about increasing the livelihoods of farmers and ensuring resilience to climate change, actually leads to a whole range of sort of repercussions that get a little bit closer of, can we get it all? In this particular case, there's even a component of ecosystem restoration. So it can be done, and I think part of what we do, IFAD traditionally, our counterpart is Ministries of Agriculture. Ministries of Agriculture in Central America, their main concern right now is food security, and for many food sovereignty, which is a different concept. So, but to the degree that we can foster this idea that we can have sort of integrated interventions that cover a broad range of issues, including lowering CO2 emissions or lowering greenhouse gases in general, we think that we could get it all at some point.
Great, very optimistic. Thank you, Juan Carlos, and I think it's a great intake on how very targeted interventions with sometimes a small scope can actually achieve all the different objectives that we are looking for. So, Cristina, what do you think about the same question?
Well, I'm going to come at that question from a different angle. I do think we can achieve it all. I think that the situation of food insecurity is created by human beings because of the inequality that exists in this world, because of the structures of the power imbalances that exist in this world. So if you think of that as the root cause of food insecurity, then you go back to, at least from my perspective as an indigenous leader and coming from indigenous lands and territories, we have seen where indigenous people's cosmovision of the world allows for these kinds of balances to exist. And so if we were to rely on indigenous innovations as a solution to increase their income and their livelihoods, I think that is worthy of looking at as a potential solution for food insecurity. But all of this is tied to the insecurity of land tenure systems for indigenous peoples. If you ask the question why this mass migration is happening from Central America, it is really because these indigenous communities, local communities, are losing access to their lands and territories. And it is the land and the territories that provide not just the food security and the food systems, but it is the place where indigenous and local knowledge exists. And those knowledge are what sustains the forests. We are not, for example, creating mechanized agriculture or monocrops, right? There are complex systems which are ecologically sound systems, food systems that exist on indigenous lands and territories. But when you begin to remove entire communities from their lands or threaten their land tenure security, then you start to see the imposition of structures and systems that marginalize these communities. And those are the conditions that create a food insecurity. So I think we can certainly achieve it. We can achieve the restoration of degraded spaces. We can stop deforestation, and we can improve livelihoods if we are serious about recognizing and protecting the land tenure systems of indigenous peoples, local communities, but also the governance systems, because ultimately it is about who is making the decisions.
Thank you, Cristina. So I think it's a great point what you're making on how we need to actually look at the indigenous communities and the way they manage the land, the way they use their nature to achieve food security, and all the practices and knowledges that could be actually expanded to different regions. And like that, like you said, these communities are actually having it all, or have I mean, they have the knowledge to have it all. It's something, I think is the best way to put it. Ricardo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. To the question, are we asking too much? Yes, I think we are asking too much, but it's not a bad thing. The higher the ambition, the higher you have to work, I guess. It's good to have high ambitions. Can we have it all? I think we can have it all, but not at the same time and not in the same place. As you were saying, there are many good practices, and I've seen agri-food system with zero emissions, but perhaps they cannot work on I don't know, improving livelihoods because they have to concentrate on zero emissions. So you have restoring natural resources, but perhaps you still need to work harder on degraded lands and so on. So I think there are many good practices that we have to widespread in order to have it all in one place in one time. As today we do have it, we have to identify where they are working and how to adapt them to different places. In that manner, the development, the rural development, it's important from the territorial approach, because each territory is different. So that one practice works over here doesn't really means that it's going to work somewhere else. So that's why we cannot have it all at the same time in the same place, but there are many things that we can do in order to bring more of those good practices to one place and to one time in order to try to solve it all at the same time. In Central America, our countries are small, and we more or less have the same problems or the same challenges. And so in order to work together and to widespread the knowledge and the information should be easier. So I think the Central American region it's a good place to begin with putting those practices in place.
Great, thank you, Ricardo. And just to continue a little bit on this conversation, what do you think that governments in Central America could do to promote food security in the context of climate change? what policies do you think could be implemented to promote food systems that improve nutritional outcomes beyond the caloric intake that is needed?
Yes. But the very first thing governments could do is, let's say, to listen to the territories. As I was saying, this is not a recipe. It's not like a cooking recipe that you add this and that. And even if it was a cooking recipe, you cook the same thing many times and it tastes different every time. So just need to go to the territories and know what they need and what they have. We have been saying that the top to bottom policies might not really work, but the policies from bottom to top, they don't work alone. They have to meet somewhere, and doesn't necessarily mean they don't necessarily meet in the middle. It's not a 50-50 thing. They could meet somewhere in between. You still need national policies, you still need national resources, but you still have the knowledge of the territories, you still have the different institutions work differently in the different territories. So what you have to do is to make tailor-made policies for these territories. Of course, there is a national, direction where the country wants to go, and even in the region, we do have regional policies in Central America under SICA. We have rural development policy, we have an agro policy for the region, we have a climate change policy for the region, but those are just for us to kind of maintain discussion on these matters, but nothing of this happens if you don't go to the territory, to the territorial level. So in order, to promote food security, you cannot do it with only one recipe. You have to do it with tailor-made policies at the different territories. They all have different necessities. They all have different advantage points. So you have to look at them and then actually take advantage of those in order to accelerate the food insecurity and to tackle the food insecurity. So from our standpoint of view, the territorial approach is a very good policy that you can use in not only in agriculture, it could be health, it could be education, the territorial approach, it could be used in many different sectors. So that's what we are actually promoting right now.
That's great, yeah. And I think your point on how policies should be tailor-made and one size can't fit all is very important when we are trying to tackle food insecurity, which is a multidimensional issue. So Juan Carlos, so I wanted to ask you about the IFAD and how are you channeling climate finance to small-scale farmers? As we all know, small-scale farmers are in the front line of climate change. They are being the most affected by it, and they are facing very clear struggles that are impacting their lives, their livelihoods, and also food security of all. So if you can tell us a little bit about how the IFAD is working on these issues.
Thank you very much. Well, IFAD, as you may know, our focus group is small farmers, and by that, small-scale farmers, and by that are those that have, I'd say, 2 to 5 hectares. So we are talking really the core producers that globally, smallholder farmers produce about a quarter of the food, but in places like Central America, it's as much as 70% of the food produced locally. If I may, I just want to start with one key point, which is we sometimes are concerned about the role that these small farmers play in food security for everybody at large in the population, but we also need to think about the food security and the nutrition of those small farmers. And what we find all over the world, including in Central America, is that if anything, when we focus only just on increasing incomes of small farmers, which is important, particularly in these initial stages of higher income, nutrition outcomes go down. Basically, the idea or the hypothesis is that even though there may be additional resources coming into the household, in part because as they move to cash crops, for example, women may move more into production, and the new income is sort of leads farmers to abandon traditional foods. Actually, you can go very quickly from low caloric intake to obesity in a very short period of time. So all this to say that one of the things that we do at IFAD is a lot of household level interventions that are inclusive. So we are not just talking about going and working with farmers, for example, on some of the new more climate resilient techniques for cultivating the land. This could go, for example, low-till techniques, increased use of organic fertilizers, which leads to increased production and increased net income. Sometimes not just because the production increased, but also because the inputs are cheaper. I mean, in many cases, organic fertilizers that are produced by the community are much cheaper, for example, than agrochemicals. But at the same time, we need to work at the household level on several dimensions. One is nutrition, make sure that the diets are diversified as nutrition increase. We also pay a lot of attention to women economic empowerment at the household level. So, for example, in Central America, most of our projects tend to have initiatives such as women-led credit cooperatives. So as income increases, how to make sure that that income is also leading to increase future activities, including many of those led by women. And I think if I may, another component that in Central America is critical is the role of indigenous people. This is something that since the creation of IFAD, IFAD, for example, is one of the few institutions that has a mechanism to directly fund indigenous people. It's called the IPAF, Indigenous People Assistance Fund. And in the case of Central America, maybe I'll mention, and I'm sure Cristina may comment on this later, we have the Resilient Rural Belize program. The Resilient Rural Belize program, which we are funding along with the GCF, a big component of the work in Belize is in Mayan communities. And we launched the project at a moment when a recent court decision in Belize had sort of formalized the concept of free, prior, and informed consent for any type of activities in the country. And we have worked with the local communities, with the government, with indigenous peoples leaders, and I think this is one of the first sort of large national projects in Belize that has been that has benefited from this free, prior, and informed consent process. And just to close, what we're doing in Belize is basically the farmers, through farmers associations, through indigenous peoples communities, prepare business plans. So they are in charge of, or they're in the driving seat of how they want development to take place. And what we do is we are financing their own community-led business plans. That leads both to increase productivity and incomes in the household, but with a focus on also increased diversity on the foodstuff that is generated, so that there's also increases the chances of improved nutrition as household income increases.
Great. Thank you, Juan Carlos. And I think it's key what you mentioned on having this household approach and, trying to take into consideration women and children and so on, no? And following on this, Cristina, we know that women, children, migrants, and indigenous populations are most affected by both climate change and food insecurity. How can we work towards more inclusive and resilient food systems that address the needs of most vulnerable populations?
It's a very big question. I do think that international corporations, and just to pick up from where Juan Carlos left, international corporations, allies of indigenous peoples, that they can become the bridge. I am, of course, a longtime advocate for indigenous land tenure systems, the recognition of it, the protection of it, and the involvement of indigenous peoples through free, prior, informed consent processes to really design and implement projects that will deliver solutions that look at the core, the interests of the indigenous peoples themselves on their territories. And so maybe one way is really to look at how we frame our interventions from the angle of collective well-being rather than just individual well-being. And I think that is critical because indigenous communities are collective, they are communal, and decisions are made in a collective way. So that's fundamental for us. I want to give some examples in Belize where we have worked on. During the COVID pandemic, we recognized that while the rest of the country was facing a shortage on food, and in particular imported food, the indigenous communities in the rural south actually were not quite affected by that. We were able to lock down our communities and still continue to produce through our subsistence farming practices the food that we needed. At the same time, though, COVID did affect us. What we saw was that these communities were unable to, as they would ordinarily do, engage in these informal trades across the border to trade their grains to, say, Guatemala. And we realized that even in our intervention to try to provide food for communities that had a shortage, we were trying to absorb these grains. And what we saw is that it's not that the farmers are not able to produce. They are producing. In fact, we could not absorb all the grain. But what we saw is that they don't control the markets, and the markets are insecure in these informal trades. On top of that, I think it's important to recognize that indigenous peoples and farmers, while they're producing these grains, they're forced to sell their grains because they don't have the infrastructure for storage and for post-harvest storage. And in the end, when they sell their grains, during the year, while that's their annual income, during the year, they still end up going back to buy grains from like the Mennonite producers and the large-scale producers at higher costs than what they had sold. So one of the innovations that we're working on is to develop these post-harvest storage and distribution centers that will focus on sort of a cooperative model to really give indigenous communities the chance to not only improve their income, but also maintain, as you mentioned earlier, maintain traditional foods within their own diets, rather than having them buy then processed food. In addition to that, I think a lot of capacity building and education around the promotion of fertilizers, insecticides, things like that in the farming practices. We also learned that if you rely on traditional knowledge, if you go back to the people, if you talk to them, if you involve them in helping to address some of these situations, we learned that one word can change everything. The way that our communities were perceiving insecticides and all these agrochemicals that are being promoted at a very high scale and that are easily accessible in Guatemala and around through these borders, they were being labeled as, in our language, as medicines. And if you think in an indigenous traditional system, you say, okay, medicines are good. right? But if they're not labeled and described properly and spoken about properly as poisons, then it immediately shifts the perception of that community from saying, no, I don't want to introduce poisons into our soils and into our foods. And I think that is just an example of how just listening to communities, engaging with them from the design to the implementation of interventions is critical, because it helps you then to deliver really on the well-being, the collective well-being of indigenous communities. Finally, I also want to echo what you have said, that I think that it's important to focus on women, because immediately when we only focus on improving incomes, by creating these markets, by affording the communities the ability to provide food to the markets, you will see a shift. I give you an example of cacao production. Cacao has become like a really big commodity in Central America and that part of the world now. Cacao, when we used to produce it customarily, it was a convivial affair. Men, women, children were involved in the production, in the processing. But as soon as we hit the market, women are completely removed from the equation. And you begin to see that the actual transaction is only done by men. And so this is a real problem. I think that women also have to be considered when we develop these kinds of transactional exchanges. Apart from that, when you look at the processing and the production of cacao, and you see that it used to be the entire family, you recognize that there was also many traditional knowledge around that, as cacao as a sacred food. Cacao is a part of our identity, our culture, our way of life, right? But then you shift and you look at cacao as a commodity, and now it no longer reflects that. And so then you start to see cacao as, well, chocolate, right? Which is not the perception from an indigenous knowledge system. And so again, while these things might seem very insignificant, they shift the way we think about health, about nutrition, about diet, about food security, from an indigenous perspective. And so I think that for women, for children, for indigenous communities, it's important to not just engage with them in terms of saying we've fulfilled our obligation to free, prior, informed consent, but really engage with them as decision makers, as those that are designing these innovations for food security, so that we can meet a collective well-being. And I really want to underscore that, because I think that until we begin to listen and not see them as, well, they're trying to veto everything, but really understand they're already creating these adaptations. They're already creating solutions for themselves. And I think that we could complement and enhance that.
Great, Cristina. I think it was very, very, important what you mentioned, and how we need to empower women and communities and listen to them, because it can be, imposed policy or an imposed intervention, but rather a bottom-up approach that meets in the middle, like Ricardo was mentioning. So we need the national, but also we need to listen to what communities need and desire for their livelihoods. So the next question is for all of you, and I just wanted to ask, based on your experiences, what would be your advice to countries in Central America regarding the do's and don'ts in terms of addressing both climate resilience and food security? Can you think about one do and one definitely don't in terms of policy? Ricardo, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. One do is that you do have to work with others. I mean, at least from the ministries of agriculture, you cannot tackle these issues by yourself, and you don't have to work alone. So at the end of the day, it's how you coordinate the policies. One of the reasons why we are here as agriculture, this is a climate change convention. At the end of the day, the ministries of environment are focal points. But that's the whole idea of being here together with them. We are not here by ourselves. Whatever we are talking about, whatever we are proposing, projects and so on, we are doing it together with them. So it's in terms of coordination. And it works the other way around. It's a double-way street. We were participating, for example, in October in Rome with FAO on this agro-system summit that they have, and we took environment with us to this because they also have a word to say. You cannot try to do it all by yourself. The problems are, as you were saying, multidimensional. There are many things that you cannot control, and the resources are very scarce, so you have to work with whatever you have, with everything you have, and mostly is the coordination between the institutions, the coordination between Council of Ministers. This morning we just had a joint session of the Council of Ministries of Agriculture and Environment from SICA together. In 2 years they have met 4 or 5 times, and they did not used to meet. They used to do everything by alone. And since they are meeting together, things have been working faster and better. So that will be our recommendation. You cannot try to do everything by yourself. You cannot do it alone. In terms of institutional coordination, and again, once you do it at the territorial level, talking to the people at the ground, things should get better.
Thank you, Ricardo. Juan Carlos.
Thank you. I'll give you 3 quick do's and 3 don'ts. Do. Invest in sustainable agriculture. By that, I think we need to move away from this mentality that there is a trade-off between higher yields and social and environmental sustainability. That is not the case. Techniques such as crop diversification, agroforestry, organic farming, we can deliver the level of food security that the region needs. Second, promote water conservation. The issue of water is becoming more and more critical in the context even of the ongoing discussions here on climate change. So anything that can be done either to increase water needs in agri-food systems or to help farmers manage variations such as, not just irrigation, but also a lot of it would be rainwater storage is critical. And third one, of course, I come from IFAD, I have to say it, support smallholder farmers. They are much more important to the food you eat every day than what you may think. And if they are well, you're also well. 3 don'ts. The first don't is don't ignore indigenous knowledge, because they've been doing it much longer than us, and they've been doing it much better than us. So it's important to make them part, not just part, but center of the solution to many of the challenges that we have in agri-food systems. Don't neglect environmental conservation. In other words, what's beyond the farm, it's still very critical to the farm. This is where you are getting your ecosystem services, where you are contribute to keep overall biodiversity, which is also critical to food security. And don't depend just on external inputs. We heard it just now from Cristina of how the indigenous communities were able to continue producing as normal during COVID, when maybe there was less access to other external inputs, also because external inputs are expensive and volatile, as the recent crises have shown. So that's our key message. Thanks.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Cristina, your do's and don'ts.
Well, my first do would be to increase your partnership with indigenous peoples on their lands and territories, protect their land tenure systems, respect it, recognize it, build that into your safeguards, include indigenous traditional knowledge, make an effort to understand better traditional agricultural systems, because there's a lot of false narratives around them and how destructive they are, when in fact there is now more and more growing evidence of how in fact they are sustainable practices. And then finally, finance adaptation solutions that are identified by indigenous communities themselves. For my don'ts, I would say don't underestimate what harms can come when you're not involving directly indigenous communities that you are creating interventions for. Don't neglect indigenous rights and human rights in your entire framing. And certainly don't allow just the states to inform your processes. It's important that you become the bridge for indigenous peoples.
Thank you. I think we had very interesting lessons on the different approaches to policies that aim to improve food security and also increase resilience to climate change. So just to conclude, I just want to mention that at the IDB, we are 100% committed to supporting the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to achieve Sustainable Development Objective number 2 of zero hunger by 2030. While boosting climate change resilience and adaptation, we know that this is not easy. I think it was clear from all of our panelists the different issues and challenges that we have, but it's essential. And we are up for the challenge, and well, we are very happy to have these panelists with us today, and I want to thank you all for coming, and please an applause for our panelists here.